Hello, everybody. Welcome back for our second lesson in this discussion about conflict after World War II. Um, let's get started where we left off. So, again, you should have at this point taken a little break. You should have thought about the discussion question on reforming the Security Council. And you're coming back now hopefully with a refreshed mind, ready to listen for another few minutes here. I know it's not easy when the human element is entirely missing from these instructional sessions. Okay, what we are going to talk about now is when does the Security Council have to make a decision about when to get involved? And so we're going to talk first about what is intervention. So all states have influence on other states. And it's an interesting question. When do we consider a state intervening in the sovereign affairs of another nation? When do we call that intervention or not? So, for example, um, the United States may ask us, for example, like if you've ever flown to the United States, you now go through customs in Canada before you ever reach the United States, right? So you could kind of see that as like, you know what, the United States, they're kind of meddling in Canada's sovereign affairs, aren't they? Now, for many people, they would probably say, I don't know if that raises or rises to the level that I would say is intervention, but it is intervention, right? Like they're deciding how we're going to live our lives. And so this is a sliding scale. What is intervention or not? All nations intervene in each other's affairs. Even small, tiny nations can have influences on us and what happens here. Um, Sometimes it's because they want to, and sometimes they don't have a choice. So you could take a country like Haiti, for example, where there's been hundreds of thousands of people who have left the country after earthquakes and disease and warfare and internal strife. And so now you've got people crossing over into Canada who were in the United States, and the United States got rid of their temporary residency ability. Now we've got people crossing over into Canada. So whether they want to or not, Haiti is influencing events that happen here in Canada. So we'll try and be a little bit more specific in talking about intervention. We might be talking about an invasion of another country. So, for example, NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that would be like Canada, the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Denmark. All these countries got together after September 11th and they agreed to invade Afghanistan. So that is intervention, right? And so that's one type of intervention. Other interventions are not necessarily through military force. So you can have economic intervention as well. And something that you guys will remember from grade 10, there was something called the water wars in Bolivia, where basically through structural adjustment programs, which were coordinated by the World Bank, the United States was able to force the privatization of water delivery in Bolivia. So basically, instead of the government delivering water to your taps, a private company named Bechtel would be responsible for that. And that was an American company. Okay, so that's a type of intervention. You could also talk about, Russia right now. They have a disinformation campaign in all liberal democracies, in places like Facebook and Twitter, where they are trying to discredit our governments and their response to the COVID epidemic. So that's something they are trying to do. They're trying to intervene in our country. So there's many different types of intervention, and there's many different reasons why states do this. So if we look at our first example, when NATO countries decided to invade Afghanistan, The purpose was for safety and security. So the idea was, well, the Taliban, which was the government who was in control of Afghanistan at the time, they gave a safe haven to Al Qaeda, who was training terrorists and trying to come up with a plan for how they could strike the United States, and basically allowed terrorist cells to form that could make strikes against the United States or other liberal democracies. So the idea was, well, if this government is going to allow this over there, we need to strike at this illegitimate government to make sure that this can't happen again. So safety and security is usually the reason that countries will say that they're getting involved. Now, another reason could be for economic prosperity. Your country will benefit from it. In liberal democracies, even if this were the reason, likely they would tell you that it was safety and security, because you guys may remember a while back, Mr. Trump was saying things like, well, if we were going to get involved, we're going to take their oil. And he was kind of saying the quiet part out loud, like, yes, we'll benefit from this. And normally, historically, that is not what happens in a liberal democracy. They make the argument that it's about safety and security, even if there is some element of economic prosperity. But let's leave that aside for a second, and let's just think about a case where economic prosperity is on the table. So when the water wars were happening in Bolivia, where there was this forced privatization of water, an American transnational corporation stood to benefit from the privatization of water. So yeah, the United States was interfering in Bolivia to try and benefit the United States. Now, the other thing you got to think about is it doesn't necessarily mean that every person in the society is going to benefit from it, right? Like some people may see economic benefits, but the vast majority probably won't, and maybe nobody will. And the same is actually true for safety and security, right? Like, if you were to invade another country to get safety and security, that might be true for some people, but it might not be true for everybody. And sometimes, well, I won't get into that aside, but sometimes these things can backfire too. Anyways, another reason that countries might get involved and how they might see benefit, there might be some cultural, political benefit or a relational goal. What that means is like, we're going to do this thing so that this other country likes us better. And so you might look at this Russian disinformation campaign, like, what does Russia get out of this? Like, why would they meddle in Canada's affairs and try to influence what we're thinking about over here about our own institutions and our own government? Well, it's because his grand goal is to stay in power. And the way that you do it is by making authoritarianism seem like an acceptable solution to a political reality. And so the idea here is like, if people over in Canada or the United States or Britain or any of these countries, if they start thinking that, look at this terrible leader over here, wait a second, we need to do something about this. His power and his country's power is in jeopardy, right? So sowing dissent in the West bolsters his political regime. And so, and again, it doesn't benefit all Russians. Like the average Russian doesn't benefit from some disinformation campaign here, but it certainly does benefit Putin, and that's what we're trying to get at. Okay, so that's why countries might intervene in another country. Going back to the Security Council, you want to be thinking about, well, why does the Security Council decide to get involved? So we've got these two countries over here that are in conflict. Usually there's an aggressor nation that is trying to intervene in another nation. What determines whether the Security Council gets involved, right? So why are they going to intervene when another country is intervening in another country, if that makes sense, right? Like, so these countries are fighting. When are we going to try and stop them? and when are we going to let them kind of go at it? Or, to what extent is the response going to be? So usually it's not all or none. It's not like we're going to totally respond with maximum force or we're going to do absolutely nothing. But on that sliding scale, how involved are we going to get? So I got some examples for you here. And I want you to think about, why is action taken in some cases? Why is action not taken in other cases? So the first case that I have for you over here is the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. This was in the early 1990s, and basically what happened was Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the rest of the world tried to get Iraq to leave Kuwait alone. And I'm going to oversimplify the analysis here, but I might say that a big part of the reason why most countries wanted to get Iraq out of Kuwait was because if Iraq was able to gain hold of Kuwait, they would have gained hold of much more oil supplies, and they would have had a greater ability to influence prices on the world market. And if you are paying attention to current events right now, there's a struggle between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and other OPEC nations about how much oil to produce. It's all about market share, how much profit they can get. Because a country like Saudi Arabia can produce oil at a really low cost price. They could probably make money off of $6 or $7 a barrel. Whereas in places like here in Alberta, that's just not possible. Companies can't make any money off of that. So there's this struggle for price or for market share, because if you have more market share, you can determine prices. And other countries didn't want to give Iraq the ability to have that much control over the market. So there's an element of economic prosperity there. Of course, there's other people who might disagree with my assessment, and I'm way oversimplifying it here. But there you go. There's a case. Look at another case I got out here for you here in the middle. So in the 1990s, the Mexican peso crashes, and basically they need money, and the IMF offers loan assistance. And the idea is that if they give them a loan, they'll be able to stabilize their currency and things won't get so bad. But with that loan comes conditions, and those conditions are called a structural adjustment program. And so what it essentially has done over the last 20 or 30 years is hollowed out Mexico's middle class, increasing inequality. So you kind of want to think about that like, well, I mean, countries got involved in Mexico's sovereign affairs. Why didn't anybody take action, right? And I would say it's because this is we as a global community, we see this type of influence and intervention in another country's economic affairs as normal, as acceptable. And because we see it as acceptable, there's no response to it, right? So think about that. Another example where there was no action taken. So in the early 2000s, so this is a decade after the first Gulf War over here, the United States decides to invade Iraq. And they do so with a few other partners like Britain. Canada doesn't get involved, that we did in the first one, not in the second one. And with this invasion, there was no response from the Security Council. So what I'm trying to do here is show you that the Security Council gets to decide under what circumstances do we get involved and under what circumstances do we not get involved. And one of the things you can probably realize from this is that when a permanent member of the Security Council is involved, it's incredibly difficult for the Security Council to take action, because the permanent member can just veto any action related towards it. All right. So sometimes the Security Council also get involved in conflicts or interventions that happen within states, right? So every conflict is not one state attacking another state or one state meddling in another state. Sometimes within the country itself, there can be conflict. And the Security Council might decide we need to get involved because if we don't do anything, this conflict could spread. And, in some cases, the Security Council is actually always supposed to do this. So, for example, most countries signed on to the Convention on the Private or on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. In other words, if a genocide is happening, all nations are supposed to be compelled to act and to stop it. And this came out of World War II, where there were the horrors of the Holocaust. And what we've seen post World War II is that though many genocides have happened, and actually very little is usually done by the Security Council to try and get involved. You'll remember last year when you were taking the course in grade 10, you would have talked about Rwanda and what happened there. And you would know that basically the Security Council did not intervene in any significant way to stop that genocide. More recently, you've probably heard of the genocide against the Rohingya people inside of Myanmar. And again, the Security Council, according to this piece of international law, is supposed to get involved, but it hasn't. So you want to think about like, well, why are some interventions from the Security Council, why are they sanctioned and others not? So why does the Security Council decide to get involved or not? So I give you some example. Over on the left-hand side, you can see some Canadian soldiers serving in Mali under United Nations peacekeeping mission. It's more what we would call later on. We'll talk about this, but it's more of a peacemaking mission. But that's authorized, right? That's something where the UN has sent soldiers to try and stabilize the country. Now you've got this other case over here in the middle where we've got the Syrian civil war. There is no Security Council intervention in the country. We're now talking a number of years on from when this conflict first started, and there's still civilians who are dying. And then you've got over here on the right hand side, as I mentioned, the Rohingya genocide, which is in Myanmar. That's where it was happening. And again, there were no serious interventions from the Security Council to prevent that from happening. So you want to think about why, in some cases, are these interventions sanctioned and in other cases not. So, what I want you to try and do is think about when you would be willing to accept a Canadian military mission or force intervening in another nation. So you want to think like, under what circumstances would I be okay with my country sending soldiers to fight in another place? You could even put yourself in that situation. Under what circumstances would I be willing to serve in a conflict happening somewhere else around the world? So you go back to your deep thoughts document, okay? And then you're going to go down here to this little section, and you're going to answer the question. All right. And that should give you a little break from hearing my voice going through and talking about all this stuff. I will see you in a few minutes to pick up where we left off on the next section of this lecture.